I told you that on the other side of the forest there lived another little girl who was quite different. She had an elfin face with straight, short, jet black hair. Her mother had made her a beautiful red cape with a hood attached, and her father, who was also a woodcutter, nicknamed her his Little Red Riding Hood. And then everyone would. She was a little older than Goldilocks and was allowed to go down the path through the wood to visit her grandmother, whom she loved dearly, but she was not allowed to dilly-dally on the way. And her father always knew when she was going and popped in later on to make sure she'd arrived safely. Well, one day Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother was ill, so a little basket was packed up with homemade cookies, a small pot of cream, and some honey from the beehive in the beech tree. Little Red Riding Hood put on her lovely red cape and hood and set off. It was a winter's morning. It had snowed the night before, but the sun was out and the air was crisp and the forest looked beautiful. Little Red Riding Hood was so happy she started to sing as she was going down the path.
Early one morning, just as the sun was rising, I heard a maid.
She stopped. There was the wolf. He'd stepped from behind a tree.
Good morning, Little Red Riding Hood,
he said. She was a bit startled.
Oh, good morning, Mr. Wolf.
And where are you going?
I'm going to visit my grandmother. She has a cold.
Little Red Riding Hood tried to walk on, but the wolf said,
Don't be in such a hurry. What are you carrying in your little basket?
I have some homemade cookies, a pot of cream, and some honey from the beehive in the beech tree.
And where does your grandmother live?
Down this path. She lives in a little cottage near the big oak tree.
Well, goodbye, Little Red Riding Hood. I must be going. It's been so nice seeing you.
And off the wolf went, walking in the opposite direction. But as soon as he was out of sight, he ran as fast as he could in a roundabout way to the grandmother's cottage. He knocked at the door.
Who is it?
It's your granddaughter, Little Red Riding Hood.
The grandmother thought,
Funny. Little Red Riding Hood doesn't usually say it's your granddaughter. Ah, well, I'm getting a little hard of hearing.
And she called out,
Lift the latch and come in, my dear.
In a flash the wolf entered the cottage, tied one of grandmother's stockings over her mouth, and another one he used to tie her hands behind her back. He opened the cupboard and popped her in. Then he quickly grabbed a fresh nightdress from the shelves and a fresh nightcap, put them on, shut the cupboard door, and leapt into bed.
I'll make a meal of you later, my dear,
he said, practicing the voice he'd use when Little Red Riding Hood arrived.
Who is it?
Asked the wolf.
It's Little Red Riding Hood, Grandmama. I've come to see how you are, and I've brought some cookies, some cream and honey.
Well, lift the latch and come in, my dear.
Little Red Riding Hood frowned. Granny's voice sounded so different with her cold, she thought. And in she walked.
Good morning, Grandmama.
She frowned even more when she saw her grandmother.
Good morning, my dear. Sit down.
Little Red Riding Hood sat on the very edge of the chair and looked, and then said,
But, Grandmama, what big eyes you have.
All the better to see you with, my dear.
But, Grandmama, what big ears you have.
All the better to hear you with, my dear.
But, Grandmama, what big teeth you have.
All the better to eat you with, my dear.
But Red Riding Hood had become so frightened she was already at the door. She opened it, and there on the doorstep was her father, who had come to see if she'd arrived all right. He had his chopper with him, and as the wolf came bounding out, Red Riding Hood's father chopped his head right off. Then Little Red Riding Hood and her father went in to look for grandmother. They looked under the bed, and then they heard a little scratching noise coming from inside the cupboard. And they opened the cupboard door to see poor old Grandmamma sitting with her hands and mouth tied up with her own stockings. They helped her out, undid the stockings, and popped her back into bed. And then they all had a nice cup of tea together and felt so safe because the horrid wolf could no longer frighten them. Mother Duck was getting to the end of her tether. She'd been sitting on her eggs for such ages. Then one morning, when the sun was rising, the eggs, one by one, began to crack, and out popped one little duckling after another. And they were so pretty. Mother Duck danced down into the nest.
Let's see if you're all here,
she said.
Oh no.
And there in the nest was an enormous egg. Mother Duck sighed as she settled down again to keep the egg warm. Although it was tiresome having to go on sitting, she did feel rather happy with her little brood. She'd never seen such pretty little ducklings, ever. Several days later, the large egg cracked. Mother Duck watched. Well, she simply couldn't believe her eyes. Out stepped the largest and ugliest duckling she'd ever seen. In fact, she began to think he must be a turkey.
Well, we'll soon see,
she said. And next day she took the ducklings to the water. In she went, splash, followed by each of her pretty little ducklings, and the large, ugly... She watched as he followed the little ones in and began swimming strongly and beautifully.
He's no turkey. He's my own little duck, and not bad looking either.
And so they swam out into the world. Mother Duck was going to introduce them to her friends in the duckyard. Oh, it was wonderful to be out again. And they all swam across the lake to the duckyard and stepped onto the bank.
Now, children, look your best, please. Don't turn your toes in whatever you do. Bow nicely to the grown-ups and say quack.
Mother Duck bowed here and quacked there, followed by her pretty little ducklings. But coming on behind was the largest, ugliest duckling ever seen in the duckyard. The turkey cock, who fancied himself no end, spread out his tail like a fan, and with his spurs strutted up to the ugly duckling and said,
Get out of my way! Get out of my way, you ugly thing!
And from then on, every day he was either pecked at or laughed at. Then the maid, who fed the poultry, kicked him and said,
Get out of the way, you ugly thing!
He seemed always to be running here, running there, trying to get away from them all. He was utterly alone. So one day he fluttered up and over the hedge and then ran over the fields and meadows until he reached the great marshes. Here the wild ducks lived. Although they regarded him as ugly, they made him feel welcome, but made it clear that they wouldn't like him to marry into their family. Then 2 wild geese flew in. The one said,
Quack, 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 fly with us to another marsh. You with your ugly young wild geese maidens, quack, quack.
Then there was a bing bang, and the 2 wild ganders fell dead in the water. The gun dogs came splashing through the water, and the reeds and rushes swayed from side to side. It was so frightening for the poor ugly duckling. He lay quite still, all folded up in amongst the reeds, until the guns stopped binging and banging. Then he left the marshes and ran as fast as his legs would carry him. But the wind! He had a struggle not to be blown clean over. Then he saw a cottage. The hinge was off the door, so in he walked. An old woman, a cat, and a hen lived in the cottage. But they kept asking him the most extraordinary questions. The cat would say,
Meow. Meow. Can you arch your back? Meow. Can you purr? Meow. Meow.
how could he? then the hen would say,
"Can't you lay an egg?"
well, how could he? And they simply couldn't understand that all he wanted to do was to be in the fresh air and float on the water and duck his head under the water. So he left. And still he had no friends in the whole wide world, but he enjoyed being on the lake once more. Then the autumn came, and one evening there was a brilliant sunset, and from the bushes at the edge of a lake a flock of large, beautiful white birds appeared. Their feathers were gleaming white against the red sunset, and they had long, slender necks. They were swans. They spread their long wings, and as they soared up into the sky, the ugly duckling heard the most strangely wonderful cries. He spun round and round and stretched his neck, and then he uttered a strangely wonderful cry, which quite startled him. The swans were on their way to a warmer land for the winter. The ugly duckling watched until there were little specks right high up in the sky. Oh, how he loved those magnificent birds. He'd never loved anything so much in all his life. In the winter, the lake froze over completely till the ugly duckling was wedged in. A farmer rescued him and took him home and warmed him by the fire. Then the children wanted to play with him, but the ugly duckling had never been treated kindly, and he was so frightened that he started to fly to get away, and his wings flapped in the pan of milk, splashing it all over the place. The farmer's wife waved a tea towel at him and said,
"Arr, you clumsy, ugly thing!"
And the next thing he knew, he was in the butter tub.
"Get out of the butter, you stupid, ugly bird!"
And still the woman ran after him. Then he landed in the bin of flour. The children thought it was such fun and were screeching with laughter. The poor ugly duckling looked a sorry sight by the time he reached the open door and rushed out into the snow. What a life! At last spring came, and in the warm sunshine the ugly duckling spread his wings. They were stronger than they'd ever been, and off he flew. It was wonderful. When he came down, he was in a most beautiful garden. He floated on a winding stream past apple trees and lilac trees. Then he couldn't believe his eyes. There, in front of him, were the beautiful white swans floating gracefully towards him. He wanted more than anything in the world to go up to them. He could hardly breathe, he was so strangely excited. Well, he thought, they can peck me to death if they like. What does it matter? I've been pecked in the duckyard, kicked by the maid. In fact, all my life I've been all alone. And he swam nearer and nearer to the beautiful white birds. The swans saw him coming. They ruffled their feathers and swam faster to meet him. He bowed his head, waiting and waiting to be pecked. But what was that he saw? Oh, what? His own reflection in the clear water. He wasn't a greyish, ugly duckling. He was a swan, a beautiful white swan. Instead of being pecked by the other swans, they caressed him with their slender necks. And then some children came down to the banks of the stream and threw some cake crumbs into the water.
"Look, look! There's a new swan! He's young, he's beautiful. He's the most beautiful swan I've ever seen."
And the other swans bowed their necks. There he was. He felt shy. He felt happy. Oh, he thought, what a wonderful world.